What Dr. Flowers just did is exactly what I said would take place. You begin at verse 45, you assign it a meaning, and then you read it backwards into the text. This happened a number of times. So right toward the beginning, he said, God gives those who belong to him to the Son, those who listened and learned. So he's jumped down to verse 45. He's skipped over everything that's come before it. He takes verse 45. He assumes that everyone has this capacity.
Dr. White pointed out that verse 45 comes after verse 44. And so he said that Leighton's position essentially requires reading the text backwards, or reading verse 45 back into the rest of the text, is kind of what White was accusing Leighton of doing. And so this is what I wrote about that. So after the presentation Leighton gave in his opener, I don't know how Dr. White could possibly make this argument unless he either was not listening to Leighton's presentation or he simply didn't understand what he said.
Look at verse 38 now. For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Notice the unity of the Father and his Son. You see this unity also in chapter 6, verse 39. You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. But the scriptures point to me, Jesus said. Notice he says, if you believe the scriptures, you would believe in Jesus. If you believe what God taught through the prophets, then you would come to Jesus. If you believe what Moses said, you would believe in me because he spoke of me. And once again, we see the exact same pattern. Jesus is rebuking them for their unbelief.
Using numerous texts from Old and New Testament, including passages from John 5, which comes before John 6, obviously, Leighton established this clear principle that is woven throughout the entire book of John. The principle that how one was responding or had responded to previous revelation would determine how they were presently responding to Jesus. And so I think that's one principle that Leighton did actually establish before he ever got to verse 45.
You must understand this repeated pattern. The unbelief of the crowd followed by Jesus rebuking them because of their unbelief. He's not merely, as Dr. White says, explaining why they can't believe by introducing the T of Calvinism's tulip and telling them they're born by default unable to believe. That's not what Jesus is doing. It's the same thing you see in John 10 when Jesus says, you don't believe in me because you are not my sheep. Sheep are known to be followers. So what's Jesus actually saying? You are not sheep, followers of me, the Son, because you never were sheep, followers of the Father who sent me. If you followed him, you would recognize his voice. And if you knew his voice, you would know my voice. Because guess what? They're the same voice. It's the unity, the theme of unity throughout the entire Gospel of John. And then the rebuke of Jesus. Again, unbelief, same pattern. Unbelief followed by a rebuke. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. Verse 45 goes on to say, it is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught of God. Everyone who has listened and learned from the Father comes to me. Again, we see the same theme of unity. Those who listen to the Father will come to the Son. Why? Because they're one.
As I'm pointing out here, Leighton, in his opening presentation, he went to places like John 5, 46, which says, for if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? So look at this passage here and just consider what it is that Jesus is faulting or pointing to as the cause of, again, Jesus in John 5 speaking to another hostile, a hostile Jewish audience, and he's faulting their prior response to Moses, and saying that it's because they had not believed his words. That is why now, when faced with deeper, I think you could say revelation, a deeper truth, which is the reality of God incarnate, the Messiah of Israel appearing, now that they're confronted with that truth, they're not going to be able to believe it. How could they believe it when previously their hearts had not become aligned with the prior teaching that God had given through Moses? And so this is just an example of, one of the multiple texts that Leighton did point to before he ever got to verse 45.
The condition for coming to Christ is that they had previously listened and learned from what the Father had taught them. So people like Simeon, or later we see in the book of Acts, people like Cornelius or Lydia, God-fearing, worshiping people who were not knowing the Son at that time, but later were drawn to believe in the Son because they were worshipers of the Father. Listen, it is no secret as to why God has chosen to entrust some people to Christ and not others. This truth is seen throughout the entire Bible. In fact, we see it in Psalm 25, where it says, "The secret counsel of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he reveals his covenant to them. He will instruct them in the way they should choose." So what is the condition? Again, the topic, unconditional election. What is the condition for being taught his covenant? It is for those who fear the Lord in faith. It's similar to what's taught in Isaiah 55, 2 and 3. "Listen diligently to me, eat what is good, and delight yourself in rich food. Incline your ear to hear. Come to me. Hear that your soul may live." Sound familiar? "And I will make with you an everlasting covenant." Notice the parallel symbolism that we saw in John 6, where inclining your ear to hear, listening, is equated with eating the food, the bread, so that what happens? Your soul may live. And notice, it's those who listen and learn from him that he graciously chooses to bring into everlasting covenant.